All right. About to begin week 4, lecture 1. I suppose I should say that for any random people who are watching my lectures. Let's invite people in, my students. Oh. Hi, everyone. All right. Only 7 of us here so far, and we still have a little bit of time. So, like usual, we'll just wait until more students show up. Let's see if I can share my screen in the meantime. Turn lava lamp on. There we go. Now what time is it? Almost time. All right, some more people showing up. Let's see, I have to go by. I've got 2 different times, my computer and my phone, and it's 7:35 on my phone. So maybe we'll slowly get started. It's actually going to be a decent amount of recap and some catch up today, because in the last lecture, of course, we did not quite make it to the end of chapter 2. I know I said the chapters for this book are dense, but one thing I've been noticing is that the chapters seem to get denser the further we actually get into the material. That being the case, if ever we do fall behind, or not fall behind, but say fail to meet our our chapter objectives for the week, we'll just catch ourselves up in subsequent lectures, as we are doing today. So, as I say in the course outline, the course schedule is always subject to minor adjustments, potentially at least. I may have to make some minor adjustments depending on the speed at which we get through each of the chapters every week. But I think we can finish off chapter 2 and get a good start on chapter 3, and then finish chapter 3 on our Thursday lecture. So before we begin, I just want to say, for all of those who are here, I have not yet begun marking your critical responses. I will probably aim to have those completed and returned to you next week. Usually I like to aim for a 2-week turnaround time. I don't have a teaching assistant in this class, but then again, this class is not really all that large. So I will do my best to have your feedback to you in under 2 weeks. But I'm wondering how all of you think you fared with the critical responses. Do you feel good about what you submitted? I know sometimes it's hard to gauge that if you haven't received any feedback yet, but you can usually tell when you finish an assignment and hand it in. If you feel good about it, that's probably good. And if you feel like you did a bad job, well, that might be bad. But does anyone feel like, okay, I got this when they were working on those critical responses? No responses. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure everyone has been hearing what I've been saying. Okay, good. Okay, good. Well, if you don't have any feelings either way about your assignments, that's all right. Okay, Leslie felt pretty okay about it. That's good. Hayden had a hard time really getting into the material, so don't know how I did. Yes, fair enough. Fair enough. This question, if you feel good about handing something in, that's good. I'm not saying if you feel like you did a bad job that you'll definitely have done a bad job. I'm certainly not saying that. So a little hard to write. Anna says a little hard to write. Coming up with critical standpoint from the first 2 chapters was a bit hard. Yeah, I mean, and as you say, and as the previous comment says, it's very dense, so that's why I really want to emphasize choosing a very specific idea to respond to, because if you try to respond to the chapter like just generally, you just can't do it in the space that you have, right? But if you've handed it in and you're not sure, don't worry. There's this curious cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Some people who are highly competent tend to underestimate their own ability. So maybe you handed something in and you feel it's terrible, but actually you did a very good job. Conversely, people who are incompetent they think that they're great at what they're doing, even though they're not good at it. So, how you feel is not necessarily a good indication of the actual quality of the work you put in. So don't worry if you feel nothing or feel something. I'm going to try to provide you all with very helpful feedback. I like to add lots of comments. I try to correct spelling, grammar, punctuation issues, at least within the first couple paragraphs, just to give you examples of, if you've made those kinds of errors, how you can avoid them in future. But I'd like my feedback to be constructive and helpful for everyone. So, that's what I will aim to have to you for next time, or for next week, I should say. So let's get started with a little bit of recap. Let's get this out of the way. All right. So a little bit of recap on chapter 2, what we've covered so far, and even prior to chapter 2. Chapter 1 is, as I said last time, all about distinguishing between emotions and other affective or cognitive states. But of course, in chapter 2, it's all about making distinctions within the category of emotion itself. So is there a way, or are there multiple ways of distinguishing between emotions? And certainly there are. And the question, the question that threads this chapter together is whether any of these distinctions we can make within the category of emotion actually threaten the unity of the category. That is, if we make distinctions between certain types of emotions and other types of emotions on some basis, does that mean that one of those groups of emotions that we've distinguished are not emotions at all? Maybe they no longer belong to the category of emotion. That's the worry. That's the question that's motivating discussion in this chapter. So a couple of the distinctions that we saw last time were between positive and negative emotions, of course, valence and polarity. And we can do this in two ways in terms of hedonic tone, so pleasure and displeasure, and between positive and negative conative states, so motivations to do something versus aversions against something, for example. And of course, we also saw that we can distinguish between conscious and unconscious emotions. And we went over several examples of that. So I won't get back into that in too much detail today. Just know that you can check out the previous lectures and the previous slides and earlier in chapter 2 to get a sense of the ways in which emotions can be conscious or unconscious. So those are two kinds of distinctions we can draw. And as we've seen, Diana and Tironi do not think that these distinctions threaten the unity of the category of emotions. So yes, we can say that there are positively valenced or negatively valenced emotions, but whether they are positive or negative, and whether we distinguish positive and negative on the basis of hedonic tone, or between, you know, what kind of conative state we're talking about, a desire to do something versus a desire to avoid something, it doesn't threaten the unity of the category. Positive and negative emotions are all emotions. Same with conscious and unconscious emotions. You can have a conscious or an unconscious emotion, but they both count as emotions. Conscious and unconscious emotions are members of the category of emotion. Now, what about other kinds of distinctions? We started to look a little bit at this last time, and some of the interesting other ways we can distinguish emotions are between those that are reflexive and those that are non-reflexive. So, of course, reflexive emotions are directed toward or felt for yourself. So they're self-directed, right? Non-reflexive pronouns are other-directed. So I might feel angry at myself for perhaps failing to meet an important deadline. That would be reflexive, but I could feel anger at somebody else, perhaps if they committed an injustice against me, and that would be non-reflexive. Certain emotions, you know, there we've just used anger. The same emotion or same type of emotion can be reflexive or non-reflexive, but there are other emotions that tend to be more reflexive just by and large, whereas other emotions are by and large non-reflexive. So shame, for example, tends to be reflexive, right? When we feel shame, we usually feel it for ourselves in, I would say, most cases. It's not like this with certain other emotions like anger, even though I used anger in a reflexive example. A lot of the times anger is directed not at yourself, but at someone or something else. There are, of course, first order and second order emotions. So first order emotions, as we saw last time, are about a particular object. They have particular objects. Whereas a second order emotion is a bit like a meta emotion. It is an emotion about another emotion. So if you're frightened by, say you're afraid of birds, you have the bird phobia. You feel frightened when you go to the pet store because they have all these birds there. But you also feel shame because you're perhaps ashamed of your phobia. The shame would be a second order emotion and the fear a first order emotion. And most interestingly to me, this is probably why we're so behind today, is because I spent so much time talking about moral emotions versus non-moral emotions, which is the third other kind of distinction we can make. You know, emotions can help us to apprehend the morally relevant features of a situation. Those are moral emotions in a certain sense, right? To go back to anger, anger can be a moral emotion if it allows us to recognize that I have been wronged, for example. Then it would be a moral emotion. Guilt would be a moral emotion in the sense that it is a way that I come to know or come to feel that I have committed an indiscretion against someone. And notice guilt and anger, you know, they kind of can go together a little bit, right? If I commit an injustice against you, you could feel anger, and I could come to feel guilt upon seeing your anger and realizing that I have wronged you, right? So those are moral emotions in the sense that they allow us to home in on these morally relevant features. And there are other morally good emotions and morally bad emotions, and they're moral in this sense. You know, envy is bad, compassion is good. That kind of distinction. So we got to talking a little bit about basic emotions too. And this is the one kind of area where the authors spend a lot of time investigating, shall we say, whether or not the division between basic and non-basic emotions threatens the unity of the category of emotion. So just to recap what we talked about last time, basic emotions are, like the building blocks of non-basic emotions. The analogy I presented last time following the textbook authors is an analogy between the elements and how they're understood in the natural sciences, and between complex chemical, like chemicals that are made up of simpler elements. So H2O is a chemical, and we would say it's complex. It's not that complex, but it's complex because it's made out of elements, namely 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. So H2O, complex, hydrogen and oxygen atoms, simpler. Perhaps, intuitively anyway, complex or non-basic emotions are just made up of basic emotions, although it's probably not that simple, as we'll see today. And by the way, another thing we talked about last time quite a bit was that this is certainly not a new idea, right? The Stoics, going all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, identified only 4 basic emotions. They probably wouldn't have used that word emotion, though. They probably would have called them passions. So the Stoics identified delight, distress, desire, and fear as emotions. This is interesting because as we get further into this chapter and into chapter 3, we start to see that the authors are making a case that desire is, whatever it is not an emotion in its own right. Closer to modernity, we have figures like Hobbes and Descartes, right? Hobbes identified 7 simple passions: appetite, desire. Again, we probably wouldn't call these emotions today. These are straightforwardly conative states, I think. Love seems like an emotion, albeit quite a complex one. Aversion, also a conative state, perhaps not an emotion in its own right. Hatred, joy, and grief, and those all seem like emotions or passions. And of course, Descartes identifies admiration and surprise. Why he puts those together is a little bit strange to me and to some of you based on our discussion last time. And of course, love, hate, desire, again, conative state, whether it's an emotion in its own right is doubtful. Joy and sadness. Of course, all of this was modernized by Charles Darwin on his voyage of the Beagle, when he started encountering lots of people and lots of animals, extinct and extant, around the world. And he noticed that certain emotions seem to involve characteristic facial expressions and physiological responses. And this idea was carried forward in the 20th century by Ekman, who identified initially 6 basic emotions. The expression, the facial expression, and the understanding of which seems to be universal across all human cultures. So we're talking joy or happiness, surprise, fear, disgust, sadness, and anger. So these are all universally expressed and understood. In later years, Ekman would add to this list, but that's not really that relevant for what we are discussing today. Of course, today, not today, but today as in this day and age, we often speak of affect programs instead of basic emotions. What are affect programs? Well, as we saw last time, they correspond to certain changes in facial expression, namely of the emotion, Muscular changes, not just in the face, but in the body. So your posture could change, your orientation would change. If you're frightened, you're probably going to look in the direction of the frightening stimulus, for example, right? Expressive vocal changes. If you're frightened and you scream, ah, well, now you let all your other conspecifics know that something's going on, and they look at what you're looking at. They look at you and see you're looking at something and look at the frightening stimulus, right? And of course, there are changes that we cannot see, but which still occur in the body, like changes in the hormonal system and in the nervous system. So you get frightened, you get a burst of adrenaline, your heart rate increases, your respiration increases perhaps. So physiological changes happen, and these correspond to particular affect programs. And the authors wrote, as I read last time, read out to you out loud, I should say, that closely associated to this school of thought, one finds the idea that the systems responsible for these changes are to a large extent modular in Fodor's sense. Jerry Fodor, the author of Modularity of Mind, which is an argument for faculty psychology. So to continue, that is, among other things, affect programs are automatic, specific to restricted domain of stimuli, quick, and cognitively impenetrable. So these are some of the characteristics of Fodorian modules. And because what is being suggested here, affect programs are realized or implemented or instantiated by modular cognitive systems, that all of these different bits of the profile are underwritten by these modular systems. So that is what the authors are saying there. Now, we want to try and finish off that pesky second chapter. We've still got lots of time to do that and to get to the beginning of chapter 3. I'm going to try and only hit the important points. After all, this chapter is so dense that I just want you to focus on the things that I think are important for understanding what is being argued here. Before we continue, I just want to know if anyone has any questions on what I've said so far. I'll just wait for a few moments in case anyone is typing anything up in the chat. All right. Doesn't seem to be any questions thus far. That is good. So, unity or diversity. We've talked about all these divisions that we can apply within this category: basic, non-basic, moral, non-moral, positive, negative, all kinds of ways we can slice up this category of emotions. So we can ask, does this word emotion correspond to a unified class of mental states? Right? Does it? Are basic emotions different in kind than non-basic ones? Excuse me, are non-basic emotions their own category of things and basic emotions their own category of things? Well, we can ask that legitimately, and the authors do in this chapter. And we can also ask how we understand the relationship between basic and non-basic emotions. And as I said, this question of whether the word emotion corresponds to a unified class of mental states in this chapter kind of turns on how we understand, turns on number 2, how we understand basic and non-basic emotions and whether they are different or the same. And this can be tricky to do, the authors, as I've said before, are taking a sort of ordinary language approach here. And they point out that at first it seems that, well, perhaps there may be reasons to think that the unity of this category is threatened, in fact. After all, emotion is somewhat of a new word. It's not universally translatable. Other words do not have, or other languages may not have a word that translates exactly to emotion in English. They might have feelings or passions, or, words like this, but perhaps not emotion. And to go back to the category of passions, well, the way that philosophers discussed passions in ages past, that was quite a huge category in its own right, which included emotions, but also pain, pleasure, so hedonic states, and also desires, conative states. Now, it's evident that not all pains and pleasures are emotions, neither are desires emotions, perhaps. So we can certainly see that this category of the passions, there's no unity there, or at least it is divisible into these other smaller categories. Is the same thing true of the category emotion? Well, maybe there isn't as big a need to worry, at least on an ordinary language approach, as there seems to be. For example, we don't seem to distinguish between emotions in the same way that we distinguish between other mental states, how we distinguish beliefs from desires, and further, how we distinguish particular beliefs from particular desires, right? We differentiate all of these different states by their content. Like if I believe that it is raining, that's a belief, but it's a different belief than if I do not believe, or if I believe that it's not raining, right? Or if I desire that it stops raining, right? So we differentiate these based on their content, but we don't do that when it comes to the subclasses of emotions, right? I can desire that it stops raining. I can desire to have a cheese sandwich. I can believe that cheese sandwiches are bad for me, right? We differentiate all these different individual beliefs and desires by their content. But when it comes to the subclasses of emotions, there are various contents that, say, an instance like an emotional episode of fright could have. Fright can be about many different things, but it is fright nonetheless, so they say. The interesting question for the author seems to be the second question, the distinction between basic and non-basic emotions. Can we use this distinction to deny the unity of this category? Well, let's see. They start out by talking a lot about the work of Griffiths here. And Griffiths thinks that basic emotions, which look like affect programs, are different from other kinds of states that we might also call emotions in ordinary language. So let's talk about affect programs a little further. Basic emotions, the authors say, look like affect programs, which resemble natural kinds. Oh boy, does anyone want to take a crack at explaining what a natural kind is?
Hello.
Hello.
Maybe. Hi. I'm
Hello.
gonna try it.
Give it a
Um,
shot. Yes.
so I did look it up because it's not intuitive. It kind of is, it kind of isn't. I don't know. In philosophy, I don't really think anything is
Yes.
anymore with the terms. But for natural kinds, I believe what we were talking about here was that they they exist kind of there is this intuitive understanding that these things exist in the world. They have this uh like without us, almost like there is this distinction between them.
Yes. Like if there were no one around to divide
Right.
up the natural
Yeah.
world into these categories, those
Yeah.
categories could still be said to exist, right?
Right. Yeah.
That
Like that.
is
That's exactly what I said.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that is one way of understanding a natural kind. So basic emotions might be natural kinds in the sense that if there was no one around, if there was no Darwin or Ekman or Aristotle or whoever, natural kinds is an Aristotelian thing, right? But if there was nobody around to say, like, okay, so these things that live in the water and have scales are fish, and these things that live on the land and also in the water but don't have scales are amphibians, and so on and so forth, right? uh those would be natural kinds. Of course, that's maybe not the best example because of Darwin, right? Life forms evolve. So are animals natural kinds? Maybe not. It depends on your scope. But when it comes to emotions, if there was no one around to say, to do like a study or something, we could still say that there are natural kinds And affect programs are natural kinds because they have, a same sort of underlying mechanisms of action or displays, like facial expressions and stuff. So those are natural kinds. This is not the only way to understand this. Indeed, the authors talk about natural kinds in a functionalist sense as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, yeah, natural
Could it
kinds. Go ahead.
could it be said that they're talking about it in like an essential way, like these things are, it would essentially be what they, I don't know if that makes sense to bring that word in here.
Yeah,
Um,
I think a philosopher would put it like, like an old-timey philosopher would be interested in essence. Maybe nowadays we'd be interested more in necessary and sufficient conditions.
right.
So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, so
Okay.
philosophers, even nowadays, philosophers don't really talk about necessity and sufficiency a whole heck of a lot, but um, perhaps if affect programs are natural kinds, then sadness as an affect program would have, there would be certain necessary and sufficient conditions that have to be met for it to count as sadness.
Right.
Likewise
Okay.
with all of the affect programs. So that's another way we can do it.
Okay.
Of course,
Cool.
I'm kind of banging my head against the wall in this chapter because I'm kind of like, why don't you guys just talk about cluster concepts and family resemblance and like
Mm.
Wittgenstein and stuff?
Hmm.
Um, but let's save that for later. Anyway,
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. So affect programs, basic emotions look like affect programs, which look like natural kinds. So what does Griffith have to say about this? Or what do the authors have to say following Griffiths? Well, they say amongst the phenomena we call emotions, those that qualify as affect programs constitute a respectable category from a scientific point of view. But those that do not qualify require a very different causal explanations and must, for that reason, be reclassified in quite distinct psychological categories. As a result, the concept of emotion is to be abandoned and replaced by a new taxonomy of the relevant domain. So Griffith seems to think that, okay, there's affect programs which, they're like natural kinds. We can be sure that they're some kind of thing. But are all emotions affect programs? No, probably not, Griffith says. We need to actually, on that basis, reclassify a lot of the things that we call emotions. And he says, Griffiths that is, says that our common sense notion of emotion doesn't just correspond to affect programs, which might be natural kinds, but also to something that he calls eruptive motivations and something else that he calls disclaimed actions. So we need to figure out what the heck those are and how they differ from affect programs. Eruptive motivations, firstly, seem to require a mastery and exercise of complex concepts that affect programs don't require, right? So affect programs are like direct responses to environmental challenges. They have the profile we just considered on the previous few slides. But eruptive motivations are not like that. They're not direct responses to environmental challenges. So if fright is a response to the threat of danger, you can see how that's a direct response to something in the environment. But an eruptive motivation, we call those emotions, but they're not direct responses in the same way to environmental challenges that affect programs are. They can also occur without some of the expressive, the facial expressive expressions or autonomic alterations, changes to the hormonal system and nervous system, for example. So the example in the book has something to do with somebody feeling guilty because they missed their colleague's talk at the university, right? You feel guilty because you missed your colleague's talk, but that's not really a direct response to any particular environmental challenge on the one hand, not in the same way that being scared by a predator is anyway. And just what the heck is the expressive or autonomic alteration of experiencing guilt? It's hard to put our fingers on it. I suppose there might be some kind of bodily change or facial expression associated with your guilt, but is it universal in the same, natural kind of way as the profile of affect programs is? Doesn't seem so anyway. So that's a couple of ways that eruptive motivations, at least Griffiths thinks, the ways that they differ from affect programs. And to feel guilty, I should say, just to bring this back to the original point, to feel guilty about missing your colleague's talk does require a mastery and exercise of complex concepts. Being frightened by a predator does not, right? What about disclaimed actions? We display the signs of an emotion when we undertake a disclaimed action without actually feeling the emotion. So maybe your colleague tells you a dirty joke and you feign offense at it. Now, maybe you're not actually offended by the joke, but you feign offense because you realize your colleague is telling the joke in an inappropriate space. For example, telling a sexual joke in the university department where that might be considered unprofessional. So perhaps even though the joke doesn't offend you, you might feign offense to show that you shouldn't have done that because you believe it was unprofessional to have uttered that joke, right? So that's an example of a disclaimed action. Now, Griffiths thinks that because eruptive motivations and disclaimed actions are different in these ways from affect programs, on the one hand, and because we use the word emotion to refer to all three, we need to reorganize things, and we need to stop saying that eruptive motivations or disclaimed actions are emotions. They could be a different type of thing. But the authors of the textbook don't think that we should follow Griffith on this. Just because our common sense notion of emotion, sorry for the poetics there, but just because this common sense understanding of emotion includes affect programs, eruptive motivations, and disclaimed actions, this does not threaten the unity of the category of emotion. That is what the authors believe. So what are some strategies that we can take towards understanding this? Oh, what happened there? No.
Sorry, I didn't type out the sentence properly. In the reading, they ask the question like what you've just posed, and then they go like, "Is this? But like, do we agree with this? No."
Oh,
And
yes.
it was so argumentative. It was just so funny to me.
It's good. It's very punchy. And by the way, this is actually a good piece of advice for your essays and future critical responses. If you can be punchy in that same way, right? That's a good way to write, because
Yeah.
you want to keep reading, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah. So absolutely be punchy like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example of that. They do not agree. Certainly, they do not agree. Why do they not agree? Well, they explain. Well, maybe Griffith's conclusions are valid in certain areas of inquiry. That is, within certain branches of science, it might make sense to divide up, affective programs and put them over here and say these are emotions, but there's also eruptive motivations and other things that aren't, and we'll categorize them some other way. And that might be valid for a particular area of inquiry. But it's also true that there are other, or possibly are other, valid standards that we can use to understand the emotions. So maybe Griffiths is right that there's disunity in the category of emotion when we look at affective programs and compare those to the other two things. But if we take a functionalist approach, right, there might still be unity within that category. And functionalism, by the way, is just an approach in the philosophy of mind where we understand mental states, psychological states in terms of their functions, right? So what is it to be in pain? Well, if you're a human, it's it's to have your C fibers firing, to use that old chestnut. So there's disunity if we do it one way, but if we take a different approach, we can legitimately argue that there is still unity within that category. So that's one way to do it. Or another thing we can do is we can try to show, as the authors do, that Griffith's arguments actually don't bear out his conclusion that the concept of emotion actually lacks any kind of causal unity. And the authors offer a few counter arguments that we can take a look at on page 23. And this is one of those particularly dense bits of the chapter. So I'm just going to go through this kind of like lightly. But one of the questions they raise here against Griffiths is to do with how affect programs differ from disclaimed actions. They say, yes, disclaimed actions certainly seem distinct from affect programs. That is true. And remember, Griffiths is using this distinction to say that affective programs and disclaimed actions are fundamentally different natural kinds, right? Affect programs are a different kind of thing from disclaimed actions, but we use the term emotion to refer to both, and that's a problem. Griffiths thinks that's a problem. Now, the authors say, well, certainly disclaimed actions are distinct from affect programs. Yes, but disclaimed actions still require mastery of certain behavioral displays. And all Griffith has really done with his argument is shown that we can attribute emotions based on signs that may not be conclusive. So if my colleague tells me a dirty joke and I feign offense at it, and my colleague, on the basis of my behavior, infers that I am offended, well, my colleague is just wrong. But that doesn't show that disclaimed actions are causally different from affect programs. It only shows, the authors say, that we attribute emotions to people based on signs that may not be all that conclusive, right? And think about it, we misattribute emotions all the time. So there is that. What about eruptive motivations? Well, when it comes to eruptive motivations, what seems to be happening is that affect programs are interacting with other cognitive states. Remember, interruptive motivations require a mastery of complex concepts, and we have to think about those concepts and check whether they apply to the situation that we're in, the feelings we're feeling, and so on and so forth. So affect programs must interact with other cognitive states in cases of eruptive motivations. But just because affect programs interact with other cognitive states, such as beliefs and desires, does that mean that we shouldn't study eruptive motivations together with affect programs? That is to say, should we not study them together as emotions, affective programs and eruptive motivations together? The authors don't think that we ought not to do that, right? And just like by way of an example to sort of, make you understand why, look at an affect program, a sort of affect program instance of fright. Say if I am presented with a snake and I'm frightened by snakes. Well, if I'm frightened by seeing a snake, that's easy to understand as an affect program because it fits that profile. It's automatic. It's not cognitively impenetrable. There are certain physiological changes and facial expressions that we can see like, oh, in this instance of fright, when we show Josh this scary snake and he goes, that's clearly an affect program. That is how his fright is realized. But the thought of a snake could also elicit fright. And this would be more like an eruptive motivation. If I started thinking of horrifying snakes and I conjured up a mental image of a snake and and how certain snakes are venomous. And I just thought to myself, oh, that's so frightening. And I felt a little pang of fear. That's quite clearly an eruptive motivation, because my affect program that underwrites my fear response is interacting with other cognitive states. So clearly this is different. It's an eruptive motivation and not an affect program. But is the fright that is elicited by my thinking of the stakes not an emotion, just because it's an instance of an eruptive motivation and not an affect program? Well, no, the authors say yes, of course it's still an emotion, right? So those are just a couple of examples of some of the counter arguments that the authors offer against Griffiths. So is the unity of the category emotion really threatened? The authors do not think so. To get to why they say this, let's just talk about how we can think of complex versus simple emotions a little bit further. So as I suggested before, we could regard complex emotions as being built up out of simpler emotions, as if basic emotions are building blocks of non-basic ones. And this could work for some emotions, but it might not work for all emotions. And the reason why it might not work for all emotions is because it doesn't consider the role that other cognitive states play in our emotions, right? So perhaps basic emotions are like affect programs, but complex emotions, we need to consider the role of cognitive states, because complex emotions might be the result of integrations or interactions between basic emotions and cognitive states like beliefs and desires. This is, in fact, the second approach to regaining unity within the category of emotions, right? So if basic emotions are affect programs, or if they're like affect programs and they're elicited by specific events, that's great. We know those exist. That's the natural kind, common to all human cultures. Great. Common to children too. Children, I would say, their emotional makeup is quite basic, but as they grow and develop, their emotional abilities get more complicated, right? So maybe to go back to the snake example, if I'm a child, my affect program for fear is elicited by certain events, like being presented by a snake. But as I grow older, affect programs can come to be elicited by thoughts too, beliefs and desires, for example. And maybe combinations of affect programs and particular cognitive states deserve their own emotional labels. Can we think of any examples, I wonder? I think an example of an affect program is quite easy to come up with. However, a complex emotion that is perhaps an affect program coupled with a certain cognitive state, what kinds of emotions can we think of, or emotional labels can we think of for some examples? This is tricky. I admit this is tricky. Regret, possibly. How so? Like, I don't just want an example of the emotion, but how, for example, could we cash out regret as a combination between an affect program and some other cognitive state, belief, desire, or a number of beliefs and desires?
Okay, so I would say that regret, maybe we could start with an emotion like sadness, which would be um, the affect program, correct?
Certainly, I would say sadness being the basic emotion, if it is a basic emotion, would
Right.
seem to be a type of affect program.
Okay. So in this example of regret, we would have that. Are we saying that there could be multiple affect programs in this, or am I allowed to just try and build it off of the one?
Well, I don't want to rule out that there could be multiple affect programs, but let's keep it simple.
Okay.
and just say that there's one affect program and some other cognitive state.
I would then say the cognitive state. I'm thinking of it in regret as well. There's a number of ways we could think of it in like a social situation kind of regret, like I regret treating this person this way, or we could also think of it in something more like personal of I regret this decision that has led me, in my own life, maybe in my job or something. So there could be sadness coupled with an understanding of social roles and expectations, and therefore I have this regret that I didn't reach this expectation. So this cognitive understanding of I guess, uh,
Yeah.
the society kind of thing. I guess I don't know.
I would say those would be, yeah, those would count as beliefs
Okay.
about, what is expected of you and
And
so
then the
on and so forth.
desire would be that you were desiring to kind of fulfill whatever the ideal version of that belief would be. I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Another one, the one that I was thinking of, and I think that the one that is in the book is perhaps sadness, which usually has to do with loss,
Mm.
and then combined with a desire to not have lost it or to remedy the situation.
Right.
So you have an affect program, sadness, and a desire, a cognitive state, which coupled together, maybe we could explain regret that way.
Right.
Any other examples? I mean, I was trying to think of some earlier today. Chelsea, you mentioned multiple affect programs. So yes. I can conceive of something like I like the example of Schadenfreude, right? The sort of the joy you take at another's misfortune. So joy or happiness is a simple emotion, an affect program, if we're following what the authors are arguing here, but it requires you to apprehend probably quite a complex situation or scenario. And so you have to have certain beliefs about what is going on. If Jones, if you hate Jones and he fails his exam, and he's always so full of himself, I'm the best in the class, rah, 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 and then he fails his exam and you take a sort of perverse pleasure in that. I mean, think of all the things you have to be representing in your mind.
So many layers.
Right? Yeah. So Schadenfreude. I was thinking of when you get verklempt. I don't know why there are so many complex emotions from the German language that we get.
I was gonna say, yeah, they've got a lot going on over there.
I think it's just because I think it's a feature of the language.
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah, I guess so. It's part and parcel.
Yeah, German has this wonderful way of describing things.
Yeah.
But when you feel verklempt, what is this? Oh, wait, I've got a question before I continue. Leslie says, I don't quite understand. So what you do is get an affect program like sadness, and then you add a desire and use that to try and explain a complex emotion. Well, basically, yeah, Leslie, I think you've got the gist of it there. It doesn't necessarily have to be a desire, but some kind of mental state. So a belief or a desire, or both, a combination thereof. And there's some, oh, sorry.
Sorry, this is Prince, what we're talking about here?
Jesse Prince?
Yeah, because they do mention, we're on page 24, kind of, is what we're, yeah. Okay, yeah. So the calibration kind of what, like, this is what he was calling it, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, Jesse Prince, I mean, like his theory is really interesting because it's an embodied theory that he's putting forward.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't know how I feel about. I like his book, Gut Reactions, but it's like he's saying, oh, emotions aren't cognitive at all. Nah, they're embodied. But then he reintroduces beliefs and desires and how they interact with these body states. So I don't know. It's been so long since I've really had a deep dive into Prince's work that I'll just I will just not say too much about it.
Okay.
But another thing that it strikes me that is discussed about Prince is that whether desires are satisfied or not, or whether certain states obtained can play a role in what emotion you feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Ellen asks, what would a combination of desire and belief be? So a very simple example would be beliefs and desires kind of chained together to explain or to motivate behavior, right? So if I desire something to drink, I'm thirsty, I desire a beverage. I believe there are beverages in the refrigerator, and this causes me to get up and go to the fridge and get a beverage, right? So that's one simple way beliefs and desires can interact. A combination of a belief and desire, to go back to the Schadenfreude example, let's say Jones is a highly competitive colleague, but he's full of himself and you're not. So you find Jones really annoying, and you just, you'd really like to see him taken down a peg. You'd like to see him fail that assignment. So Jones is like, oh, I just handed in my assignment. I feel great. I've done so well. And then he gets his mark back. He gets like an F. And you're like, Jones, yeah, not so great now, Jones. That's because you believe Jones is full of himself. You desire to see him being taken down a notch. And when your desire is fulfilled, you take a perverse sort of pleasure in his failure, right? So that's one way this can all interact. And Chelsea, yes, politics too. The election. So I'm on Twitter, and I don't want to get too political here, okay? But I'm not going to say who I voted for, but I tend to kind of sit on the left-wing social democrat kind of thing. And so I'm on Twitter, and I'm seeing all these hashtags for the People's Party.
Oh,
and
God.
I'm face palm. And I'm just like, oh man, not my political cup of tea at all. I don't like their populism, but we're in a purple wave. It's going to be a purple wave, guys. It's going to be purple. They did not win one seat.
Was not the case. Yeah.
And when I'm looking at the results, I'm just like, major Schadenfreude.
Thank God for the Germans and their language.
Yeah. So thank you for the German language for giving us a word to describe my feeling of elation when my political enemies fail. So that was great. So we better move on, though. It's great to have this discussion. However, this is what happened last time, and I think I should have just stopped talking and carried on. But anyway, all the examples we've been talking about kind of highlight this thing that the authors say on page 24. On this theory, a non-basic emotion is nothing but a basic emotion caused by a judgment, type of mental state, concerning a kind of circumstance that is seen as sufficiently important to receive a distinct name, right? And this is something that Prince's theory actually does have in common with Lazarus's appraisal theory. Lazarus says emotions are cognitive, and they are basically appraisals, judgments, right, about important things that are happening to us. Prince argues very much the same thing. He just says that they're embodied representations, not like mental representations, right? So have we regained unity in the category of emotions? Well, the authors say that neither of these approaches we've just taken is really sufficient to flesh out the difference between basic and non-basic emotions. I know I was just excitedly saying, look at all the ways we can make sense of being, having Schadenfreude or feeling verklempt or some complex emotion. But some of those approaches work for some emotions, some other approaches work for other emotions, but neither approach can be plausibly applied to the entire category. So does that mean that Griffiths is right? Well, I don't think so, and neither do the authors. The authors say, and this is, I think, a point Chelsea raised in the Discord server. If Griffith's account only stands if, quote, the three distinctions, one, between affect programs and eruptive motivations, two, between what is independent of higher cognitive states and what depends on them, and three, between phenomena that share surface properties in virtue of underlying causal mechanisms and those do not, are all in fact coextensive. So, are any of these actually coextensive? Yes, the coextensive headaches, correct. I think that what this means is that, Griffith's account can only be correct if all of these distinctions hold. That is between affect programs and eruptive motivations, between independence of higher cognitive states and things that depend on higher cognitive states. All of these distinctions, all three of them have to hold across the board, across the entire category. And they don't. That's what Diana and Tironi tried to show. Yeah, necessity and sufficiency. Yeah, basically like there would have to be necessary and sufficient conditions to count as an affect program and an eruptive motivation. And those would have to include features of dependence or independence on higher cognitive states, surface features and stuff, all of this has to hold across the entire category, and it does not. Whew, that is what I think the authors are saying. So what do they conclude? Well, they say that after having considered, and I'm quoting directly here from page 26, after having considered the distinctions between positive and negative emotions and between conscious and unconscious emotions, distinctions that do not threaten the unity of the category of emotion, we have investigated the distinction between basic and non-basic emotions. We have seen that the idea that there exists a class of emotions completely insulated from complex cognitive states is mistaken, and that there are no conclusive reasons for thinking that an emotion cannot belong to our basic emotional repertoire simply because it depends on such complex cognitive states. So we still have some unity here. Thoughts before we begin chapter 3? Okay, I will take everyone's silence as a sign that we have no thoughts. Yes, yeah, that's good. All of you, like as Chelsea says in the chat, if you find that you're honing in on the same stuff that I'm honing in on, that's probably a good thing. And by the way, I'll say something about these chapters is, I've been saying this ad nauseum, they are dense chapters. And sometimes when you're in the thick of reading them, you're just like, ugh, like what? And then when you get to the end, for all of the density and convolution, the conclusions of the chapter really clearly lay out the main points. So, you could almost read the intro and conclusion first, and then go and read the whole chapter, and then read the intro and conclusion again. And that will, that's what I've been doing when I'm putting together my slideshows and my lecture notes. So that's what I recommend that you all do. Just saying. Okay, so in that case, now we'll go on to chapter 3. So emotions, beliefs, and desires. So chapter 2 is all about divisions within the category of emotions. Chapter 3 is about the relationship between the emotions and other cognitive states like beliefs and desires, which, which, as I have said in some lectures previous to this one, these are all mental states that we often characterize as propositional attitudes. And these play a big role in what we call folk psychology or common sense psychology, or sometimes even propositional attitude psychology. This is the everyday understanding of other people's thoughts and behaviors. So that will be a theme in this chapter and through the rest of the book too. So you'll want to be familiar with folk psychology or propositional attitude psychology. So this chapter is all about assessing two groups of theories. One group, which they're sort of collectively labeling the mixed theory, is a theory where emotions are either wholly or partially constituted by cognitive states, right? So sometimes an emotion can just be a cognitive state, like a belief, a desire, a judgment, something like that. Or the second option, emotions are not combinations of beliefs and desires, but rather they are representations of how our desires fare. Neither theory is perfect. Each theory, has problems that it needs to answer, needs to overcome before we can accept them. Now, we're not going to get to either theory today. We're going to cover these two theories next time. But first, we want to discuss emotions and belief a little bit further. Let's see what time we have left. We've got 2 slides left. Time to go over those and have a little discussion. All right. So what's the difference between emotions and beliefs anyway? Well, all emotions, remember, are triggered by some eliciting condition or thing, right? Emotions have, as Richard Lazarus said, elicitors, right? Or to put it in Diona and Tironi's words, they have specific objects. Could be a person, an event, a scenario, something you imagine, a thought that you have. But there's an elicitor that elicits the emotion. There's a particular object, something the emotion is about. And notice we can always sensibly ask what an emotional episode is about. Remember, emotions are intentional. They're directed at something. They're about something. They have this aboutness to them. And that is why we can say that emotions have cognitive bases, right? Remember cognitive bases all the way back from chapter 1? We can think of some examples of emotions and their cognitive bases now, right? There's a couple examples in the book which I've adapted here, if I have the belief, there's a dog I fear, I believe it is dangerous. There's a typo there on my slides, but what are you going to do? Anyway, if I believe there's a snarling dog in front of me, then I might feel fear. So my belief that I'm standing in front of this snarling, growling dog is the cognitive basis for my fear. Or if my cat is ill, if I believe my cat is ill, then that is the cognitive basis for my sadness. What about some other examples? I mean, I guess a good example, just to go back to Schadenfreude again, but Jones's failure in his assignment or at his assignment would be the cognitive basis of my Schadenfreude. Can we think of any other examples? All right, well, that's all right. We can keep going with these ones because we have to ask, are all emotions judgments like this? If I believe I'm seeing this snarling dog, I judge it to be dangerous and I become frightened and I want to get the heck out of there, right? Can we account for all emotions like this? No, we cannot. There are reasons to think that this is going to be difficult for us because, we got a question in the chat. Oh, this is a good example. Okay. So your favorite artist is coming out with a new album and that makes you excited. So you have a belief, your favorite artist is going to drop a new album. Yes, that would be the cognitive basis for your excitement. Yeah, that's a very good example. So, can we specify different emotions on their cognitive basis? This is the question. And there are reasons to think that we cannot. This is actually a really good example, like excitement or fear or sadness. Meaning, what? I'm not quite sure what you're typing, Chelsea.
Sorry. Like specify as in, are we able to like pinpoint this one emotion specifically?
Type of emotion.
Okay.
So like, and that's where I was about to go with the example.
Okay, keep talking.
Yeah, no worries. Like, okay, so in a situation like the one I described, I believe that the dog is snarling. So okay, fine, that could be a cognitive basis for fear. But I might also be a dog trainer, and I'm training the dog for I don't know, like a movie role to get the dog to snarl because it's an actor dog. And I'm amused because I'm getting the dog to do what I want it to do. So the exact same cognitive basis, the belief that the perceptual belief specifically that I'm standing in front of a snarling dog could be a cognitive basis for fear or for amusement. Likewise with the cat example, right? If I believe that my cat has had an accident, perhaps I'm sad because I'm worried that my cat will die, right? Or I could be a horrible person and feel relief because I just want to get rid of this old terrible cat, right? So the same cognitive bases can subserve different emotions, and that's why this can't really account for the specificity of emotions, as the authors say, right? Now, do beliefs have the same explanatory role as emotions? Well, probably not, right? And we've just seen that. Emotions seem more closely tied to particular kinds of motivations than they are tied to beliefs, right? Different beliefs can serve as the cognitive bases for the same kind of emotion. I believe this venomous snake is going to bite me, or I believe there's a spider crawling on me. These are all different beliefs that can serve as a cognitive basis for fear. But the same cognitive basis, as we've just seen, can also subserve different emotional responses, right? So we don't have necessity and sufficiency here, just to stick with that example, right? So let's move on. So there's one account of emotions that's quite interesting that requires the presence of beliefs or judgments of the kind that we've examined. Can this help us to account for the specificity of emotions? Well, the authors think that there are reasons to doubt this as well. All we have to do is keep those previous examples that we came up with in mind, right? Like I just said a moment ago, imagine those people had a different emotional experience, but the same belief, right? It seems to spell trouble for this thesis. And conversely, sure, people can have similar beliefs and different emotions, and people can experience similar emotions, but the cognitive bases will perhaps be different beliefs, right? So maybe beliefs don't have the same explanatory role as emotions do, because they seem to be more particularly tied to beliefs. And we have two approaches that we can take now that we've, I think I've accidentally duplicated this slide and not done it. Humbling to myself here. Oh, no. So there are two approaches we can take going forward that the authors advocate. We can look at the mixed theory, which, as I said earlier, is it introduces the notion of desire, and it says that emotions are combinations of beliefs and desires. Oh, we have a question. Wouldn't it be really hard to say what the specific emotion is, though? Like, only the person who would be able to say what the emotion is the person feeling it. In a sense, yes, Leslie, I would say. But in the sense that we're attacking the problem here, like we're philosophizing, right? And we want to know, if, say basic emotions combined with certain other mental states is what will allow us to distinguish, this emotion from that emotion, right? So we're trying to come at it, and this is very hard to do, but we're trying to approach this objectively. And what you say is correct from a subjective standpoint, but what we're doing here is trying to objectively, come up with some objective criterion by which we can distinguish the different emotions. What is it that distinguishes all the different emotions? But what is it that they have in common by which they are all emotions, right? That's what we're trying to do. Yes, Chelsea, good observation. This is one of the coolest things about philosophy of mind in general. And I think about philosophy of the emotions. It's like I said before. Okay, good, Leslie. I'm glad that makes sense. Yeah. Just to go back, it's like I said before, I was paraphrasing Dan Dennett. Philosophy is what you do when you don't know what questions to ask yet, right? And everybody could see, if you're a psychologist, maybe you want to go and study some emotions, hook up some galvanometers and stuff, and study some emotional reactions, and you'd get some interesting data, and that is certainly worth doing. But what are the emotions? Like, what is an emotion? That's what we're doing here, right? And we need both. We need the theoretical and the empirical, the conceptual and the practical, the philosophical and the scientific. We need both. They complement one another. They really, really do. Yes, everyone, Chelsea and everyone else, definitely study cognitive science. It's wicked, totally awesome. You get to philosophize and spend time in the laboratory. I can think of no other discipline which is so much fun, except I don't know, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, so we've got two approaches that we're going to look at next time. We've got the mixed theory. We bring in the notion of desire, and we look at emotions or complex emotions as interactions between basic emotions and beliefs and desires. Probably more so desires, right? Then we're going to look at another theory where we introduce the notion of value. And this is the sort of satisfaction frustration approach. So this is where emotions start to seem like evaluative judgments, and we feel certain emotions based on whether our desires are satisfied or not, right? So that is what we will be getting into next time. Be warned, the rest of the chapter is somewhat dense. However, next time I will do my best to distill everything and have you focus specifically on what I think is important. This book is great. The chapters are great. They go through a lot of examples because, again, they're doing ordinary language philosophy, right? So that's why they have so many examples. What if Jones and so and did this versus that, and we'd say this in this case and that in another case, right? That's what takes up a lot of the time, is illustrating the claims they're making, right? But that's why I like to have people in the class come up with examples too. And that way we can, maybe skip going over a dry example from the book and come up with an interesting one on our own. Anyhow, that is it for today. Today we're going to wrap up chapter 3. and go on to the rest of chapter 3 next time. Yes, in the chat, Chelsea, I'm getting tired. More coffee. Close reading. Yes, that is a very good idea. What I like to do when I'm preparing is read through the whole chapter, just read it beginning to end, and then I go through it again, and I highlight. That's when I get the highlighter out and I do my close reading. Add to that my suggestion that you read the intro and conclusion. Just read those, then go back, read the chapter, then go back again and highlight, and stuff will start to stick.
Yeah. I used to think that once I got better at school, I could just read things once. And it's just been the case that now that I've gotten better, I just read everything so much more.
Yeah.
So more times with different purposes each time.
Yeah, I would do the same thing. When I was an undergrad, one of the studying hacks that I would use is and this works differently for different people, but I think I have a pretty reasonably good memory, and I would write down whenever I was preparing for a test or an assignment. I would just write down everything that I could remember from my mind.
Yeah.
Then I'd fill in the blanks from my lecture notes, and I'd write all the things, like who was Socrates, who was Plato, what is anamnesis, what are the forms, and I write all this down from memory, supplement with the lecture notes, and then those would be the notes that I would study. But I found that by the time that I had written the thing, I was like, I didn't need to study it, because I just by recalling it and writing it down really shores up those neurons, so.
Yeah, I do it more with talking, because I just, as you can tell, I like to talk. And
that's fine.
Just talking to my cat, I'll just tell her so much. She knows so much now.
Well,
and then
lucky.
Yeah.
Maybe your cat will learn to experience complex emotions, perhaps.
I don't know if we need that from cats. That's dangerous.
Yeah, that could be evil. Yeah. True. Maybe it's good that yeah.
We'll have to see.
We'll have to see. Luckily, my cat is not here at the moment. He cannot plot against me. But yes, non-human animals. And there's something that hasn't just. I know that most of the people have already left. We've still got 8 people here. But before I go, one thing the authors have not considered so far, which just seems weird to me, is language.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's gonna come.
I hope so, because I've mentioned this before. Language is like a cognitive technology, according to Andy Clark, for example, which allows us to assimilate concepts and build, like to build second and third order concepts.
Yes.
You need language. Like we've done this with apes, right? Where we can get apes to understand first order relations just by giving them a reward for doing something right. But unless we teach them to sign and teach them ways of talking about second order relations, they don't get it, and we're just apes. So that maybe that's why perhaps lower mammals probably have some basic emotions. Higher mammals, like the ones we talked about before, the social animals that don't have language but have intricate forms of communication and culture, like elephants and cetaceans, experience more complicated emotions, and humans perhaps experience the most complicated ones.
Right.
Although who knows, perhaps whales
is having a really good time.
What's that?
Perhaps a shrimp is having a really good time and we're just never gonna know.
Maybe, like a shrimp, but then again, a shrimp might only be either happy or afraid or something. But perhaps whales and dolphins have some kind of complex language that we don't understand, and so perhaps their emotional lives are as rich as ours. We don't know. We need a Rosetta Stone for like whale song, but we don't have that. So
that's I think I touched on it last time. I know we're still in class and I don't want to be taking up anyone else's time, because I could talk about this forever,
Oh, it's fine.
you-
I'm here. If there's still 6 people, I guess they're here because they're curious about this. So yeah, go ahead before we wrap up.
This is what, like, I'm so interested. I mentioned this last time. I'm so interested in studying this specifically because of I've so much experience in therapy settings, and seeing how different therapeutic methods work with people at depending on the level of language that they have. And when you get to a certain point in adulthood, like developmental psych, you can look at things, with children, like, okay, this is going to work with a child because they only have the problem of, like, they didn't like their peanut butter sandwich, or there are
Right.
obviously cases where there is something more severe going on. But we get to a point, in adulthood, where there are these additional problems. And in the case that somebody doesn't have not even just a complex language base, but, like, what if they don't have a maternal language at all, like a home language? And so I'm really interested in studying that with ASL, sign language, because a lot of adults
Ah.
who in their 50s who are deaf were not allowed to sign when they were children. They needed to learn how to hear.
Oh, I
The
see. And
implications, their ability to understand or even talk about the language of emotions and how.
right. And this goes to Leslie's point in the chat. Like, language doesn't always need to be verbal. And that's an excellent
Yes.
point. Sign language, I would say, I don't know sign language. So unfortunately, I don't know enough about this, but the way that certain concepts are represented by signing may be different than the way I do it by stringing words together. And perhaps there is a cognitive difference there in terms of how
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
understand concepts. So that's a good point, Leslie, that you've raised in the chat. But whether we're signing or speaking or whatever, I really like this thesis that language is a cognitive technology. And this is actually quite radical, right? If you say to somebody, I actually did say this when I was an undergrad, I said to a political science professor of all things that language was a technology. And he's like, I disagree with you. I didn't understand why at the time. But of course, when we talk about language, we talk about natural language, right? Our linguistic abilities are something that evolved, but we can use language as a technology, as a tool. And we do this all the time. The same way we can count on our fingers. Our fingers have evolved, but we can extend our cognition into the world by counting on our fingers. Same with language. No problem.
Are you doing any research on that right now?
Not at the moment, but if you want to pick my brain about this over Discord sometime, I can share resources. I'm not a linguist, but I like to think about.
You are working with, right? This is your thing, is you're focusing on technology. And I was looking a little bit into
technology. Is the philosophy of technology is my thing. Yes, one of my things.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I can help with that.
That's really cool. Okay, I'm definitely going to, because I just seeing so many things as a vehicle for that which we're studying here.
Yeah. Just one quick thing before I go. Another thing in the chat that we got here is from Leslie again. Leslie says she knows a small amount of sign language. I don't think there is a difference. There is a difference. I don't think it's a crazy difference, but still. Yeah, again, I'm not sure, Leslie, but if I want to string a sentence together in English, there's a certain, way I have to do that grammatically. But the grammar of other languages, be they spoken or signed, affects the way we think. Okay, so example of what I'm talking about is like math performance in languages with regular counting systems versus irregular counting systems. So,
oh my God.
English is weird, right? We got weird numbers like 11. Like, what the hell is 11? I got 8, 9, 10, and then 11, and then 12 and 13. And then it gets
Okay.
a little more normal. It's a little more regular, like 15, 16,
Mhm.
17. It's a little more
Right.
regular. But 11, what?
Okay.
Look at a language like Japanese, right? You count 1, 2, 3, ichi, ni, san. And then when you
Mhm.
get to 10, ju. 11, juichi. 12, juni. So
Oh,
literally
wow.
translated, it's 10, 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3. It's more regular than English. And students who speak languages with regular counting systems like Japanese, Chinese, or Turkish
Mhm.
tend to perform better at math, right? So language can shape cognition.
Oh my goodness. So I was talking about this in class this morning. I'm in a personality seminar. We're talking it's a lexical model of personality. This is how we understand personality. We have to just derive it from how we talk about it in the world.
Yep.
And I was talking about how when we look at blame or responsibility for things, how we attribute something to someone's personality versus how we're attributing it, something occurring to just like chance. In Spanish, they have this say there was a TED talk I watched about some guy saying how in Spanish, say somebody broke a lamp, they would say,
I think I've read this paper actually. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
like in English, so and so broke the thing. And so, like, it would maybe be so and so is a klutz, or so and so is clumsy, so and so is careless, as opposed to this just happened and this is independent of the person. How are we
Yes.
building identity
Oh,
on this?
you're
Oh my
right.
God.
Shit, I read that paper in my pro seminar in my PhD. I remember. I don't remember the title of the author, but yeah, I've read that paper.
Right. And it was like, it blew my mind. I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And there's many
I
other
would be who
examples
I am.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing, but language can work to shape our thoughts. The only example, the other example, it's a good one, is like languages that have gendered versus non-gendered pronouns, right? Like, so how if you're an English speaking say like non-binary person, you might adopt a gender neutral pronoun like they. And then some people might be like, what, those idiots like Ben Shapiro who don't want to say they or whatever, right?
Brains are not.
Yeah. So, but other languages have gender neutral pronouns already, and some other languages don't have any gendered pronouns. And it's actually been shown that it can have an effect on the acceptance of like, language surrounding like trans and non-binary members of society. So, yeah, language shapes thought. It's, yeah.
Oh, it's so cool. It's so
Very
good.
cool.
And
Very
then so
cool.
this comes exactly back to here, especially when we're talking about emotions and cognition. Like this to me is just insanely cool. It's so amazing. So I'm really excited that you made that connection there. And I'm eager to see like yes, Leslie, I'm happy we are all on this wavelength of excitedness over language.
Agreed.
Do they talk about it later?
I hope
Do they
so.
talk about it later in the Okay.
I will.
I'll
I'm
have
gonna
to look
have to
ahead.
read ahead and get back to you. But if they don't, I'll recommend some stuff you'll probably find interesting. But yeah, thank you guys for
Okay.
sticking around. It's always fun to kind of riff on some other stuff that's you maybe just not directly related to the class, but indirectly related. And this is one of those things. This is good to know when you're thinking about what you're going to do for your final essay. So yeah, and it's also fun to talk about. So, thanks. It's been fun chit-chatting about language in the mind. All right.
Thank you so much.
What's that?
Later.
Oh,
I think
my audio seems to be cutting out. I don't know if you guys can still hear me. Oh, it's in the chat. Oh, I was going to say same. Anyway, that's all. Have a good night. Leslie, you're the only one left. I'll see you all next time. Bye.